Ashes of Creation has now been on Steam for several weeks. Last week, we had a deep dive into the numbers of concurrency, reviews, and revenue. We now have enough distance from launch hype and the numbers to start asking real questions about where this game is headed. This video is about how financial runway, development timelines, and public messaging started to converge in 2024, and what that convergence might mean for 2026. As we get started, I want to specifically say that this is not meant to be a doom video. This is not meant to be a hate video. This is a pattern analysis video that I have outwardly and internally discussed for some time, and I feel it is at this point an important conversation to have. I've followed Ashes of Creation since 2016. I've made content since 2017. I want this game to succeed, and when patterns change, it's worth slowing down and asking why. Some of you will probably strongly disagree with some of what I have to say, and that is okay. Frankly, I hope that some of my observations and conclusions are ultimately wrong. This will be a long and information-dense video, so feel free to jump to different chapters. I have put links to all of this information in the description, so you don't have to just take my word for it. Let's start with publicly documented facts and history. Intrepid Studios has been developing Ashes of Creation for nearly a decade. We were introduced to the Ashes of Creation Kickstarter on May 1st, 2017. Here, nearly 20,000 backers pledged $3.2 million. At the time, it had an estimated delivery of December 2018 and was noted to be fully funded by the owner, Stephen Sharif.
We have enough self-funding to create a core viable product in Ashes of Creation, but we really want to expand it. We want to make it bigger and better, and we know we can achieve that with your help.
Ashes of Creation entered its first testing phase, Alpha 0, in December of 2017. We were then introduced to Ashes of Creation Apocalypse, or APOC, in September of 2018, which was a battle royale meant to test combat and networking. APOC closed on March of 2020. We then entered into Alpha 1 in July of 2021 and Alpha 2 in October of 2024. Early access officially began December of 2025. During this time, we also saw a switch from Unreal Engine 4 to Unreal Engine 5, and currently the team is using Unreal Engine 5.6. Stephen Sharif has said that during the switch to Unreal Engine 5, many of their development tools had to essentially be redeveloped for the new engine.
I would say that, we had definitely some reset on systems when we moved from Unreal Engine 4 to Unreal Engine 5. That was particularly true when it came to the map of the world as well.
Cosmetics were sold from 2019 through 2024 as the main source of revenue alongside key purchases and various pre-order packs. These pre-order packs cost between $75 and $375. In August of 2024, Intrepid introduced a three-wave process specific to Alpha 2 keys, which granted access to Alpha 2 at different times, and ranged from a price of $100 to $120. During this time, cosmetic sales were suspended. With the opening of Steam Early Access, the sale of cosmetics has now resumed. Cosmetics have ranged in price from $5 to $25. Stephen Sharif has made several public comments about the costs of developing Ashes of Creation. Most recently, he stated that the studio's weekly spending is around $800,000, which comes out to nearly $3.2 million per month. This figure is based on a reported team size of about 250 employees. During an August 2024 livestream, Stephen said that the project had cost roughly $90 million up to that point. He also stated that roughly $30 million of that has come from pre-order sales and Kickstarter. Based on that statement, it would mean that around $60 million had come directly from his own personal funding at that time. That livestream took place about 17 months ago. During the same interview, Stephen said the studio had over 200 employees at that point. Using the current spending estimates, this suggests that an additional $50 million may have been spent since then. The Kickstarter itself raised about $3.2 million. If roughly $30 million total came from Kickstarter and pre-order sales combined, that would suggest approximately $26.8 million was generated through pre-order packages and cosmetic sales between 2019 and 2024. Spread across that 5-year period, this works out to about $5.4 million per year. Intrepid also received 2 government loans during the COVID period, both of which were later forgiven. The first loan was issued in April of 2020 for $1.1 million and listed 52 employees at the time. The second loan was issued in February of 2021 and totaled $1.4 million, with 82 employees reported. Combined, these loans provided a total of $2.5 million. In addition, public legal documents show that Intrepid Studios has had at least 2 outside investors. One of these investments occurred in August of 2019, when an investor purchased a 5.3% stake in the company for $2.2 million. There is also a second stock purchase agreement dated July of 2016, although public records do not list the amount invested or the percentage of the ownership for that deal. From 2017 through 2024, development moved at a slow but steady pace. Progress was visible, but it was measured and often took longer than many players expected. However, starting in the second half of 2024, the pace of development appeared to increase much more quickly. That raises an important question. What changed in 2024, and how did we get from years of gradual progress to now openly talking about a beta potentially arriving in 2026? Everything up to this point is about context, because without that context, the rest of this video doesn't make sense. What comes next isn't speculation, it's about documented changes that start showing up right after 2024. Between 2024 and 2026, several UCC filings appeared in California public records tied to Intrepid Studios. UCC filings are typically used when a lender secures an interest in a company's assets. Public records show that multiple parties were involved, and at least one lender later appeared as a partial owner of the company. One UCC filing appeared in May of 2024, followed by another in August of 2025. As I was finishing this script, yet another was placed on January 14, 2026. During the same timeframe, a legal action was filed by an individual seeking access to the company's financial records. As an investor in a California corporation, this type of request is legally allowed. That filing occurred in June of 2024 and was withdrawn in July of 2024. Public records also note that this same investor had previously placed a UCC on Intrepid Studios in 2020, which was later allowed to expire. Additionally, Intrepid Studios was temporarily suspended as a company by the state of California in April of 2024, and was later returned to good standing in November of 2024. During the same period, there was also a brief change in the individual serving as Chief Financial Officer. Shortly after these events, we began to see a much faster and more structured rollout of Alpha 2 for Ashes of Creation. The plan to begin Alpha 2 in October was announced very late, at the end of July 2024. In August of 2024, the Alpha 2 roadmap was publicly revealed. Phase 1 was scheduled to begin in October, Phase 2 in December, and Phase 3 was originally announced for May of 2025, before later being delayed to August. It is important to note that meeting the goals laid out in this roadmap proved to be difficult. The Steam Depot for Ashes of Creation was opened on October 20th, 2025, a little over 2 months after Phase 3 began. According to reporting, the move to Steam Early Access was communicated internally to Intrepid Studios staff for the first time on October 30th. A scheduled development livestream was originally planned for that same day, but was ultimately delayed until November 14th. It was during that November livestream that the move to Steam Early Access was publicly announced. This announcement was notable because after the failure of APOC, Stephen Sharif had previously stated multiple times that the studio would not return to Steam. Not long after the Steam announcement on November 23rd, Stephen made a late-night post on X, where he publicly discussed the possibility of beta in 2026 for the first time. In December, he followed this up with interviews with multiple content creators where he repeated the same timeline. During an interview with Dusty Y, Stephen Sharif was asked about his hopes for 2026. He responded by saying,
and then my hope is that we find great partners next year so that we can, continue to deliver on established pipelines that we iterate on, that the community is receptive to and wants to see more of. And then that we find ourselves with significant progress towards a beta next year.
Stephen did not clarify what he meant by great partners, or who those partners might be. He was later interviewed by a group of creators that included Vladis Gaming, Nice Gaming, Lude Lloyd, and Zyback TV. During that interview, Stephen expanded further on how the team is thinking about beta and release. He stated,
with regards to, us moving into beta, obviously our goal is to get to beta in a sustainable, quality-driven way, right?
Absolutely.
And our focus for beta is to establish the core systems of the project, but also making sure that we're answering our Kickstarter promises, because at the end of the day, this project was born from Kickstarter.
And so at a minimum, those Kickstarter promises are going to be fulfilled.
He then added that some content or features introduced over time could potentially be pushed back to after release.
Now, to what degree that, content and features that we've, brought along the way might get deprecated for a post-release update, that's still outstanding conversation, right? And that changes literally on a month-to-month basis. So I can give you some answers here as it stands today, so long as every person listening understands that that is subject to change.
What stands out in these statements is the repeated emphasis on meeting Kickstarter goals as a minimum requirement for release. This was not the first time hints like this had appeared. During an August 2025 livestream, Stephen Sharif spoke about beta as the next major milestone and said that development was now on a new track toward beta.
Your job is to provide a schedule, essentially a roadmap internally that looks towards the next big deliverable.
Yeah.
Beta.
And that next big deliverable is beta when it comes to a phase. So we know there's a lot to get done with regards to that, but those plans, the train is now on a new track, and that track is how we get to beta.
That same month, during an interview with Copium Clinic, Stephen brought up the topic of exit criteria for alpha without being prompted. He told the community to look forward to next year when discussing plans around beta and launch.
Now the mind shifts. The mind is, how do we exit? And what does exit mean, right? What does it mean to move into beta? Once we get into beta, obviously then that's going to shift towards how do we launch?
Not long after that, Stephen was interviewed on Golden Feather Tavern, where he mentioned that the team already had the story for their first expansion mapped out. This stood out given that the game was still in alpha testing at the time.
There's a few ways to think about expansions. Obviously, from a storyline perspective, I think we have a pretty good handle of what the launch story is going to be, what the first update is going to be.
He later followed up with a comment on Discord, stating that the team would talk more about beta and launch plans in January. So stepping back for a moment, here's why all of that matters. As we can see, there has been a growing amount of discussion and movement pointing toward a beta in 2026. We can also add to this how Ashes of Creation has performed during its first several weeks in Steam Early Access. As noted in my previous video, it appears that Early Access sales may have generated the equivalent of roughly 3 to 5 months of development spending. At the same time, we can see a steady decline in player concurrency. The growth of estimated owners has also slowed, which suggests that incoming cash flow is likely slowing as well. Total review counts are also beginning to slip. So where does all of this leave us heading into 2026 when it comes to beta and a potential launch? Before moving forward, there is another piece of history worth revisiting. During the previously mentioned interview with Dusty Y, Stephen Sharif made several interesting comments about the business side of game development. When asked how Intrepid Studios plans to avoid the same outcome as other recently closed Western MMOs, Stephen said,
Well, Intrepid has a unique history. On one side, there's a level of financial independence that is not predicated, that has not historically been predicated on our engagement within the investing ecosphere of gaming. In order to bring to life this project.
What stands out here is his self-correction and the use of the word historically. This raises the question of whether that relationship with the investment ecosystem may now be changing. In the same discussion, Stephen also noted that attracting investors requires showing both community engagement and sales, two things that can be demonstrated through a Steam Early Access launch.
They are dependent on publishers and investors. And those groups of people, they look to see, do you have a community behind you?
Definitely.
Do you have a consumer waiting to purchase the thing that you want?
During this conversation, he also mentioned Intrepid's introduction of AI into the development pipeline.
Now, we do use AI, and we have begun to adopt AI as much as we feel is appropriate. We have an AI council that we have internally, which is comprised of a number of our leads and directors, so that we are capable of properly evaluating the ramifications of certain AI usage and how it is being applied in the most respectful possible manner.
When asked about the ideal size of the studio, Stephen said,
If I were to have answered that question 5 years ago, I would have said that our ideal target is about 250. And I held true to that for several years. And I don't think I would change that answer necessarily today.
While he does not directly say that the studio wants to reduce its workforce, it is notable that he frames the 250 employee target in the past tense, referring to what he believed 5 years ago. He also went on to speak at length about outsourcing portions of development.
And, we've seen, of course, cyclical approaches in the development industry where, you hire on a bunch and then you lay off a bunch and you hire on a bunch and you lay off a bunch. And Intrepid never wants to be in that position, right? And I think the best way to guard against that going forward for the outstanding needs that we have in additional support, development support, is to create good relationships with outsourced studios who can plug into our pipelines that we have generated and can, on a contract basis, help to support what our development needs require.
Another interesting pattern to look at is Intrepid's historical difficulty with meeting timelines, both in game development and as a company. We have already discussed how the company was previously suspended by the state of California due to missed deadlines. Because of that history, it stood out when Intrepid's next statement of information, originally due in May of 2026, was not only filed on time, but 5 months early, on December 30th, 2025. This filing means Intrepid will not need to submit another statement of information which lists the board of directors until May of 2027. That raises a simple but important question. Why the rush to complete this before the end of the year? There could be many explanations, but it does not match Intrepid's historical pattern. From a timeline perspective, Ashes of Creation has stretched from a 2017 Kickstarter with a 2018 target into nearly a decade of development, moving through multiple alphas, a full engine switch to Unreal Engine 5, and finally Steam Early Access in late 2025. Financially, Intrepid Studios has now publicly acknowledged roughly $90 million spent by mid-2024. with ongoing burn estimated at about $3.2 million per month, funded through a mix of Stephen Sharif's personal capital, pre-orders, cosmetics, forgiven COVID loans, and at least some outside investment. Since 2024, we've also seen clear business inflection points: UCC filings, brief corporate suspension, leadership changes, faster alpha rollouts, and a reversal of the long-standing no Steam stance. At the same time, Stephen Sharif has increasingly framed 2026 as a beta target, emphasized fulfilling Kickstarter promises even if features are deferred, hinted at new partners and investors, discussed outsourcing and AI in development, and subtly shifted how he talks about staffing and financial independence. Taken together, the timeline, spending pressure, and Stephen's own words suggest a studio that has entered a new phase. One where beta planning, business structure changes, and financial stability are now tightly linked. At this point, it's worth pausing to consider a set of purely hypothetical scenarios. If a studio were facing financial pressure, what kinds of outcomes might reasonably follow? For example, what if cash flow constraints led to delays in planned Alpha 2 bonuses, shifting them from October 2025 into February of 2026? What if, in an effort to ensure long-term stability, outside investors were brought in? What if that process resulted in the formation of a formal board of directors? And what if December played a key role and directly influenced how a beta in 2026 is being positioned? None of these points are presented as established facts. However, if developments like these were to occur at any game studio, they could have meaningful implications, potentially influencing oversight, accountability, and decision-making. Framed this way, these questions invite a broader discussion. Would circumstances like this change how we interpret a move to Steam Early Access, or how we understand development priorities heading into 2026? Even as hypotheticals, they highlight areas worth examining as the project continues to evolve. So with that recap and those hypotheticals on the table, the next question is pretty straightforward. If 2026 really is the year they are pushing toward beta, what does that actually look like in practice? And more importantly, what pressures could shape that decision? Based on the numbers we have already covered, Steam Early Access appears to have generated roughly 3 to 5 months of development spending on the high end. That's not nothing. That matters. But it also leads to a hard reality. If Steam Early Access was meant to help stabilize finances, then the runway it creates is not very long. And that runway gets even shorter if player concurrency keeps dropping and sales slow down, which is exactly what we are seeing now. So the core question becomes this: if Steam was meant to buy time, how much time did it really buy? And if that time is measured in months instead of years, what gets prioritized next? I've long said that beta would likely land in late 2026 and that release would be in 2027. But if the studio is looking at a tighter runway than expected, a faster push toward beta and release starts to make more sense from a business perspective, even if the game isn't ready from a player perspective. The reason is simple: subscriptions are recurring revenue. A box price is a one-time payment. Subscriptions renew every month. And once subscriptions begin, cosmetics can continue to rotate alongside them. So even if you don't love the idea of rushing, it's not hard to understand why a studio might feel pressure to move in that direction sooner. That's the tension I keep coming back to. The financial model rewards getting to subscriptions quickly, but the state of the game rewards patience. The part I worry about most, though, is what happens to the team. This is where my biggest concern sits, and it's not about drama, it's about people. If we take Steven's recent comments seriously about AI being added to the development pipeline, about outsourcing content creation, and about how he once believed 250 employees was the ideal target, those aren't neutral topics. Those are the exact areas companies talk about when they're looking for efficiency, cost control, or scalability. And if Steam Early Access only bought a few months of runway, then the number of levers a studio can pull becomes very limited. You either increase revenue, reduce burn, or both. Reducing burn usually means some mix of slowing hiring, restructuring, outsourcing work, or cutting staff. None of this means layoffs are planned. It means these are the levers studios talk about when margins tighten. This is where those earlier hypotheticals come back into focus. If a studio were dealing with cash flow pressure, and if things like bonuses were delayed into early 2026, you can see why people start asking uncomfortable questions about timing, staffing, and internal changes. To be clear, I'm not accusing anyone of anything. I'm saying the pattern itself is what makes people uneasy. If beta is pushed faster, what are the real blockers? Even if the studio tries to move quickly, the game still has hard limits that don't care about schedules. From where we are now, the two biggest barriers to a real beta are clear. First is server stability and large-scale performance. If players can't stay connected, if PvP breaks down under load, or if the game can't handle density, then the entire promise of Ashes collapses under its own weight. This has to improve in a major way. Second is botting, hacking, and enforcement tools. Right now, enforcement appears heavily manual. If players believe bots and real money trading are allowed to thrive, they won't stay, and they definitely won't subscribe. I'll say this plainly. If a game can't protect its economy and competitive space, players will treat it like it has no rules. Once that happens, you've lost the foundation needed for a long-term MMO. Those aren't the only issues in the game, but right now, they're the ones that decide whether the word beta actually means anything. Another thing that stood out in Steven's recent interviews is the growing focus on what looks like minimum viable product thinking, even if it wasn't always labeled that way. We heard that some features could be pushed to post-release. We heard repeated reminders that plans are subject to change. We saw a stronger emphasis on fulfilling Kickstarter promises at a minimum, even if other content gets deferred. That points to a possible future where release becomes more modular. Stabilize the core systems, deliver the minimum promised scope, ship earlier, and add content later. That approach can work. Some would argue it's the only realistic way Western MMOs survive long-term. But it does come with a cost. It changes what launch means, and it changes what many longtime followers thought they were waiting for. Steven has said we'll hear more about beta and launch plans during the January livestream. And I'll be honest, the fact that launch is even being discussed is what really caught my attention. Because in terms of content, systems, polish, and stability, this game is nowhere near what most players think of as launch ready. That livestream matters not because we need a perfect roadmap, but because we need clarity. Even simple answers would help. Are we still thinking late 2026 for beta or sooner? What is considered minimum viable product for beta and for launch? What systems are non-negotiable? What gets deferred? What does success actually look like from here? And do you announce new partnerships with investors and the formation of a new board of directors? Is it announced that Steam Early Access allowed Intrepid to find new investors that gives us more development time? Hopefully this roadmap will answer a lot of questions and calm a lot of anxiety and fear. Because right now, the pattern looks like a studio entering a new phase, one where timelines, staffing, and business strategy are more tightly connected than ever before. So with everything on the table, the history, the numbers, and the risks, here's where I land. I want to end this the same way I started. This isn't a hate video. This isn't doom. I still have hope, and I genuinely believe there are improvements that could make the experience meaningfully better without needing a miracle. Real stability gains, economy and crafting tweaks, quality of life fixes, better PvE loops using the content we already have, and PvP incentives that create real conflict instead of constant crate-running drama. Can they make the game feel meaningfully better in 6 months? Yes, I think they can. But whether they do it in the right way depends on the choices they make next, and whether the push toward beta is being driven by readiness or by runway. And that's why 2026 is the year that matters. As always, thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and share, and I'll see you in Vera.